I was 14 years old at the time. It was early November, and we were in northern Michigan, deep in the Huron-Manistee National Forest, a vast and remote area. My dad, Mark, had taken me on the annual hunting trip, as he had done since I was little. This time, my cousin Ryan, who was 19, was with us. This trip was a chance for me to feel like part of the team, as if I were older than I really was. The air was freezing, and the sun was starting to disappear behind the skeletal trees. The leaves had fallen weeks ago, and the ground was covered in a carpet of dry leaves and broken branches. After a long, unsuccessful day of hunting, my dad decided it was time to call it quits. He and Ryan began setting up camp, and I was in charge of closing up the hunting tent. I was alone, just a few yards away from the clearing, and the darkness was beginning to take over the forest. As I finished securing the tent, a sense of unease began to grow inside me, a different kind of cold, one that ran deeper, spread through my body. That's when I heard something. A snap in the woods, followed by a heavy silence that seemed to swallow all the sound around me. I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sound could have been a deer, but there was something off about it. On the ground, near the tent, I saw tracks. They were large, much bigger than anything I expected to find in the area. They looked almost human, but distorted, as if whoever had made them didn't walk naturally. The unease I felt quickly turned to panic. I glanced toward the clearing where my dad and Ryan were, but they couldn't see me. And then, I saw it. Among the shadows, there was a figure, tall, unnaturally tall, shrouded in a darkness that seemed to move with it. The creature didn't make sense, like a nightmare that had slipped out of my imagination. It moved slowly, each step making a dry, cracking sound on the broken branches. The thing was watching me. My body froze. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but the terror had taken over completely. When the creature took another step toward me, something inside me finally snapped. I ran. I ran without looking back, fear driving my legs faster than I ever thought possible. Each breath burned in my chest, and the sound of my footsteps on the dry leaves was followed by something much heavier and faster. It was chasing me. Every step I took felt like it wasn't enough. The noise behind me grew louder, and I knew that if I stopped for even a second, it would catch me. The clearing with the campfire was up ahead, but it seemed farther and farther away. The presence behind me was close, so close I could almost feel its gaze on the back of my neck. When I finally reached the camp, I stumbled and fell to my knees. My dad and Ryan turned instantly, alarmed by the noise. "Ethan, what happened?" my dad asked, rushing over to me. I tried to respond, but the terror still gripped me too tightly. All I could do was look back, expecting to see the thing emerging from the forest. But it wasn't there. The figure, that terrifying presence, had vanished. My dad put a hand on my shoulder, saying I must have been scared by some animal. Ryan laughed, trying to calm me down, but I knew that wasn't an animal. That night, I didn't stray far from the fire. I stayed close to them the entire time, but I couldn't sleep. Even back home, days later, the fear lingered. The memory of that figure in the shadows haunted me. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still feel its presence, as if somehow it's still out there, watching me from a distance, waiting. I had always sought the peace of Maine during hunting season. Every year, I set aside a week to isolate myself there, far from the hustle and bustle of work and the city. This year, as usual, I rented a small rustic cabin via Airbnb near Acadia National Park. Being in such a remote place made me feel more connected to nature, something I deeply valued. The cabin was basic, but it had everything needed for a comfortable stay: one bedroom, a simple kitchen, and a fireplace to warm up the cold November nights. I was isolated, surrounded by trees with a trail that led directly into the forest where I hunted. Knowing I was within the legal hunting limits, I always checked the permits before heading out. On the second day of my stay, I left early for the forest. A dense fog and the biting cold followed me as I walked in silence, alert to the slightest movement. Along the way, I came across an elderly man. He seemed to be there on purpose, as if he had been waiting for me. He wore an old coat and a hunter's hat, but his eyes, cold and scrutinizing, made me uncomfortable. "You shouldn't be hunting around here," he said abruptly. I stared at him for a moment, confused. "I checked the permits. I'm in the allowed area," I replied, trying to stay calm. He shook his head, never taking his eyes off me. "Not here. I'd advise you to leave." That encounter didn't feel right. I shrugged it off and moved on, but the unease stayed with me, like something was out of place. Even as I walked away, I could feel his eyes following me. That interaction with the old man left me unsettled, but I tried to ignore it as I continued hunting. The usual calm silence of the forest now felt oppressive. Every so often, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling as if I was being watched, but every time I looked, no one was there. As dusk began to settle in, I returned to the cabin. When I got there, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it before I left. A chill ran down my spine as I approached cautiously. I pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. Nothing seemed obviously out of place at first, but after a closer look, I realized my things had been disturbed. My backpack had been moved, and the coat I'd left on the couch was tossed carelessly. Nothing was missing, but it was clear that someone had been there, someone who wasn't me. An overwhelming sense of unease took over. My mind immediately jumped to the old man. Frank. Could he have broken into my cabin? It didn't make sense, but I couldn't shake the thought. I carefully shut the door and double-locked it, trying to convince myself it was just a misunderstanding. But something told me he was involved. That night, every little sound had me on edge. I barely slept. The next morning, I decided I couldn't let things go like this. I left early again, not to hunt, but to confront Frank. I took my rifle more for safety than with any intent to use it. As I walked along the trail, the sounds of the forest felt distant, muffled by the growing tension. After some time, I finally spotted him. He was standing among the trees, as if he knew I was looking for him. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm, but laced with frustration. Frank looked at me with the same coldness as before, showing no sign of surprise. "I told you to leave," he said, his tone unmoved. "You broke into my cabin. That's trespassing. If you had a problem, you could have spoken to me directly." He shrugged, as if my accusation didn't matter. "I just wanted to make sure you wouldn't cause any trouble. This land is delicate, and people like you don't understand it." My patience was wearing thin. "Look, I'm not here to bother anyone. I've always respected the rules, but what you did is beyond acceptable. If it continues, I'll have to call the police." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "The police? Out here, they have no power." That line set off alarm bells in my head. There was something more going on, something I didn't understand, but it was clear Frank wasn't just some eccentric old man. I decided I'd gotten in over my head. "I'm leaving, Frank, but make no mistake, it's not because I'm afraid of you." Without waiting for a response, I turned and started walking back to the cabin. I felt his eyes on my back the whole way, but I refused to look back. When I arrived, I quickly packed up my things and left the cabin earlier than planned. As I drove away from Acadia, a mixture of relief and deep unease followed me. Something about that encounter made it clear there was more to Frank's story than he was letting on. Since then, I've never returned to Maine to hunt. What used to be a refuge of tranquility became a place of disturbing memories. Even now, I still wonder what Frank was really protecting in that forest. I was 17 when I went on a hunting trip to Texas with my dad, Tom, and two family friends, Bill and Lucas. Every year, we'd head out to this remote ranch in the middle of nowhere. It was a vast stretch of land, full of hills, gnarled trees, and that sense of isolation my dad loved so much. It was the kind of place where silence ruled, and any noise, no matter how small, stood out. We had already been there for a few days. During the day, we hunted and explored the ranch, and at night, we'd gather around the campfire to unwind. That particular night, the cold felt sharper, and the wind was blowing harder. We were sitting around the fire, laughing and telling stories, when suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was a scream. Something I'd never heard before. It sounded human, but at the same time had an animalistic quality, like it was some sort of hybrid between the two. The sound echoed through the hills and reverberated in the air, instantly killing the relaxed vibe around the fire. We all looked at each other in silence for a few seconds, trying to process what we had just heard. "Must be some animal, maybe a mountain lion," my dad said, trying to sound confident, but there was a hesitation in his voice. The problem was, none of us fully believed that. The scream didn't sound like anything natural. It was long, distorted, and left an unsettling feeling in the air. We tried to carry on with the night, but the mood never really returned. Soon enough, we all retreated to our tents, though the memory of that disturbing scream wouldn't leave my mind. The next day, things seemed calmer. The sun had come out, bringing with it a sense of security. My dad, Bill, and Lucas decided to explore a more distant part of the ranch to try their luck hunting. I decided to stay behind, alone, at one of the hunting cabins. I needed some time to relax, organize the gear, and to be honest, I wanted some peace after the tension of the previous night. The cabin was small, with old wooden walls and a single window that looked out into the forest. I'd been inside for a few hours, sorting through the gear, when that feeling of unease began to creep back in. The silence around the cabin felt heavy, like something was about to happen. It was the same kind of silence I had felt the night before, just before we heard the scream. Suddenly, movement outside caught my attention. I looked out the window and saw something shifting between the trees in the distance. At first, I thought it was some kind of animal, maybe a deer. But as the thing got closer, I realized it was nothing I had ever seen before. The figure was distorted, wrong. Its movements were awkward, like it was limping or dragging itself. It was hard to see clearly from that distance, but something about the way it moved sent a chill through me. It was tall and skinny, but its silhouette seemed deformed. As it got closer, I could tell that its body didn't look human, nor entirely like an animal. And then I heard the scream again, the same unsettling sound from the night before. Only this time, it was much closer, and it seemed to be coming from that distorted figure. Fear gripped me. The scream cut through the air like a blade. My heart raced, and my entire body tensed up. The thing was getting closer to the cabin, and every step it took was erratic, like it was stumbling, yet somehow moving fast. The scream came again, louder, filling me with panic. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to defend myself. I grabbed my rifle, trying to keep my hands steady, but fear made my whole body shake. The figure kept getting closer, moving out from the line of trees and heading toward me across the clearing. Without thinking, I aimed the rifle through the window and fired. The gunshots echoed through the cabin, loud and deafening. I fired multiple times, but the figure kept coming. Each shot seemed useless. Panic overwhelmed me, and I couldn't think straight anymore. I bolted out the back door of the cabin, feeling my lungs burn as I ran through the forest. I ran as fast as I could, the sounds of the scream still ringing in my mind. Terrified, I eventually found the rest of the group. My eyes were wide with fear, and I could barely explain what had happened. I told them about what I'd seen, about the scream, and how nothing seemed to stop that thing. They tried to calm me down, but it was clear something wasn't right. That same afternoon, we decided to cut the hunting trip short and leave the ranch. The experience had been too unsettling, and none of us wanted to risk staying another night. Even now, that scream continues to haunt my thoughts. I don't know what that thing was, but I know I never want to go back to that forest again. I've always enjoyed hunting alone. The peace and solitude of Kentucky's forests gave me a kind of freedom I couldn't find anywhere else. At 23, this was my escape. I'd take my truck, an old Chevy I'd fixed up myself, and spend days camping in remote areas, far from any sign of civilization. It was just me, the woods, and time to reflect. That afternoon, I was in one of my favorite spots, an isolated part of the forest near an old trail that almost no one used anymore. I spent most of the day sitting in a tree, waiting to spot a deer or something worth hunting. The sun was setting, and I started thinking about climbing down and heading back to the truck when something broke the silence. I heard heavy footsteps, branches snapping. I looked around, alert, trying to figure out what could be causing that. It wasn't the sound of a typical deer, it was something bigger. The dry leaves rustled, as if something large was walking through them. The peaceful afternoon turned into a tense silence. I tried to stay still, watching, but unease began to settle in. There was something out there, something I couldn't quite see. I could sense its presence, but whatever it was, it stayed hidden in the shadows of the forest. With the sun nearly gone, I decided it was time to get down from the tree and head back to the truck. Something about the situation told me I shouldn't stay any longer. I climbed down from the tree faster than usual. Darkness was settling in quickly, and the forest felt different at night. The sound of my boots crunching over the dry leaves was the only thing I could hear, and the unease was growing. Something wasn't right. I tried to find my way back to the truck, but I soon realized I was disoriented. I knew this area, I'd hunted here before, but for some reason, every tree, every twist in the trail felt out of place. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight, but the light felt weak and insufficient. The darkness was thicker than normal, like the forest wanted to swallow me whole. As I walked, trying to calm my nerves, I saw something up ahead. 2 figures. They were standing still, right in the middle of the trail. They looked human, but there was something strange about them. They were tall, thin, and they made no sound. They just stood there watching me. My breathing grew heavier. I didn't know what to do. Yelling for help didn't make sense. I was alone, deep in a forest that was becoming more and more hostile by the minute. The figures didn't move. I wanted to believe they were other hunters, but I didn't approach them. Something about the way they stood there, completely still, was unsettling. I tried to look away and keep walking, fast, but I could feel the weight of their gaze on me. The fear grew with every step. The darkness around me felt alive, and I couldn't tell if those figures were following me or if it was just the fear taking over my mind. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures didn't move, but I knew something was wrong. I needed to get out of there, fast. When I finally spotted the truck, I felt a brief sense of relief, but it vanished as soon as I got closer. The tires were flat, all 4 of them. I stopped, trying to make sense of what had happened. Sabotage. There was no other explanation. The unease in my gut turned to full-blown panic. I looked around, expecting to see the figures watching me from the tree line, but the forest was silent again. Whoever, or whatever it was, had me surrounded. I pulled out my phone, but the signal was too weak to make a call. I tried sending a message to my dad, but I didn't know if it went through. My only option was to stay put, trapped in my truck, and wait for daylight. The night felt endless. Every sound from the forest sent my heart racing. I stayed on high alert, my rifle in my lap, ready to act if necessary. Time dragged on, and the fear that those figures were nearby kept me wide awake. When the first light of morning finally broke, I tried my phone again. This time, I managed to reach a friend who was a few hours away. He came to get me later that day. As I waited, the relief of surviving that night was mixed with a deep sense of defeat. I would never know who or what had flattened my tires that night, or what those figures standing in the middle of the trail were. After that, I decided I wouldn't hunt alone in that area again. Some things can't be explained, and maybe it's better not to try.